Good evening. Welcome back after our hiatus of prayer and worship and snow over the last few weeks. So just a reminder that we've kind of rejiggled the schedule a little bit because of the snow last week when we had to cancel Dr. Brooks Schramm. He will be here the 17th, next Monday. So Dr. Mellott will be here tonight. And then we will switch gears for 1 week to get the Dead Sea Scrolls in. And then Dr. Mellott will be back again for the last 2 weeks of our program. The session that we are postponing is the pastor's session, which has always been a highlight of our year, in which you think up these very weird, strange questions.
And we do them all on you to answer.
And then, yes, well, no, we love to just give them to Mark, Pastor Mark Kopp, because Mark just has the ability to talk for an hour on every one of them. And so the rest of the pastors just kind of sit there and bask in the fact that we didn't have to put ourselves on the spot. So we apologize, but if you have any questions that you would like to ask the pastors over the next 3 or 4 weeks, just write them down on a piece of paper and bring them next Monday night or the other 2 Monday nights, and we will divvy them up and we will get back to you with answers. If we have time on that last night, we'll take a few minutes. If not, we will make sure that you get a written response to your question. Okay? Now, please address them all, unless you can address them all to Pastor Kopp if you want to spend an hour or two reading his answers. If you want to get them answered very quickly and succinctly, address them all to Pastor Beth. I'm out of town. No. You can address them to the pastors, you can address them to a specific pastor, whatever, and we'll try to make sure that we get back to you with any questions. If it's a question about one of the sessions, we'll try to get that instructor to answer that question for you and get back to you. We don't want to kind of leave that just hanging, so please know that you can do that. Tonight our speaker is Dr. David Mellott. I got to read this thing here. He is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Lancaster Theological Seminary. That's still true, right? Okay. I didn't ask you about this, so I want to make sure. Associate Professor of Practical Theology. That's an oxymoron. Practical theology? As opposed to what? Theoretical theology?
Yes, probably.
Okay. So,
Philosophical theology.
oh, philosophical. That's the Hans Kung stuff? Okay. When I was in seminary, we just called it theology, and you know.
That's because you're old.
I know. I know. Yeah, let's see. When I was in the seminary, it was Pius XII was Pope. And he's also director of Ministerial formation. David will lead us in prayer as we begin. But David, thank you very much for being here.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for that warm introduction. I'm going to move this a little bit.
No,
Yeah, it looks like there's more cords, so I don't think there's... you won't bite me, right?
no promises.
No. Depends on what I say, I guess. Good. It's always great to be in Columbia to join in this adult education program. One of the things I like about it is that it's an ecumenical opportunity to talk about really important aspects of the Christian life. And it's always wonderful for me to get out and talk with people who are living day to day, everyday Christianity, and trying to make sense of what it means to be a person of faith. So we're all doing that together. So I welcome the opportunity to be here with you. I thought maybe for our opening we might sing. I like to sing. I always try to get everybody to sing. So, and this one, I'm sure you know, you don't need any papers, This Little Light of Mine. So, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Amen. Let us pray. On this cold night, O God, we give you thanks once again for the many ways in which you have nourished us and sustained us, not only throughout our life, but also through this day. We pray that you would help us to be aware of your presence ever more deeply as we contemplate the spiritual path. Give us wisdom and courage as we contemplate what's so important to us. Nourish our faith. Help us to rely upon one another and draw us ultimately closer to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So when Father Patrick and I started talking about the opportunities to teach this year, we talked a little bit about spirituality, and one of the things I floated by him was the possibility of maybe talking a little bit about what I said was sort of less common melodies in the spiritual life. And I put something together which was handed out and eventually publicized. And as I looked at it, again in preparation for the sessions, I realized that the first one might be considered more common in some ways than the other two, because it's something that a lot of us have talked about or at least heard about throughout our life. The topic for the 24th of February, after the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going to talk a little bit about when the soul gets weary on the path. This is actually a topic that I've hardly ever heard talked about in Christian spirituality circles, even though there's been some publishing on it, about the fact that leading the Christian life over time, there are moments when we get bored and complacent and tired. And sometimes we misinterpret those signs for lots of other things. And sometimes we think, surely enough, if we're being conscientious and disciplined and trying to be faithful to our spiritual life, that wouldn't happen, but it actually does. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's worth talking about. And then on the 3rd of March, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be, or to resist being afraid when we live in a fearful world. That doesn't mean that we don't have fears at times, but to live in fear is another matter. And so we're going to talk about that, because that's something, all you have to do is watch the news one night. And you know, somehow, I don't know whether it's on purpose or not, but somehow people want us to live in fear, right? There's always something that's going to get you. And so much of our culture relies upon that notion, so they encourage us to do all kinds of things, take out more insurance, to put in more security cameras. Killer bees are coming for you from the next country over, right? I mean, there's always something that's on your doorstep that you need to do something about. And as Christians, unless we really take precautions and pay attention, we can sort of digest and imbibe and live out of that kind of fear on a day-to-day level, on a day-to-day existence, which we certainly don't want to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to resist that kind of fearful living, and what does it look like to live in a world that does have things to be concerned about, but ultimately when you live a life of faith, Jesus says constantly to us, do not be afraid. So we'll think a little, look into that a little bit. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about self-awareness. And maybe that particular topic might not be so common, might not be talked about so often, but certainly elements that have to do with the word self. So self-awareness, selfish, self-denial, all words that are kind of thrown about in Christianity in a variety of ways. And as we get ready for Ash Wednesday, I'm sure many of you will be gearing up for your annual practice of something that you're going to do in preparation for Easter. And it's usually as that Easter and Lent and Ash Wednesday approach, the language of self-denial gets thrown about really quite explicitly and often. So I thought this might be worth taking some time to unpack this a little bit, unpack what it means and what it doesn't mean. And also I've given you some questions at your table to think about, and we'll get some information from you in a few minutes and have an opportunity to do some sharing. But I thought, let me say a few kind of introductory comments. So if you look up the word selfish in the dictionary, I'm sure that you could probably give the definition that's there. What would you imagine? What's the definition of selfish?
Greed.
Greed? Say a little more.
Just doing things for yourself, for your own benefit, instead of helping someone else.
That's right. That's right. Greed is one example of it because we think about it as money, but when you go below it, it's focusing on oneself or doing for oneself even if somebody else is in need or withholding something. We might also call it caring for oneself only, right? In other words, it's not just that you take care of yourself, but you take care of yourself at somebody else's expense. That's usually what we mean when we say selfish. What about self-aware? It's not something we talk about too often, but it's certainly, in the seminary where I work, self-awareness is like every other word. It's just constantly talked about. So when somebody is self-aware, we talk about being self-aware, what do we mean? What do you think we mean?
Able to recognize underlying emotions and senses.
Mm-hmm. Identifying and being attentive to underlying emotions and perceptions. Or faults. Self-awareness often comes in terms of looking at our weaknesses. Are we aware of our faults? Mm-hmm. Basically, self-awareness is about knowing oneself, right? In other words, knowing who we are. And sometimes, unfortunately, the way in which it's often characterized in Christian circles, especially, I would say, in congregational circles, unfortunately, is around faults, right? In other words, we say we want to be self-aware, and immediately we go into confession mode, So especially if from a worship point of view, a liturgical point of view, self-awareness automatically moves us into this thing, okay, I got to think about all the things that I've done wrong. But self-awareness actually isn't just limited to that. Self-awareness is all sorts of things. And I would say even self-awareness is far deeper than anything to do with our own faults. Self-awareness has something to do with our identity, about who we are. Our faults, actually, as much as we obsess about them, and as much as maybe some of us pastors preach about them, our faults actually are really quite minor in the conversation around self-awareness. And as a matter of fact, sometimes focusing on our faults obscures the real conversation that we need to have about self-awareness and about who we are, which is kind of why I wanted to talk about this tonight. The thing is that when we move between these two things, and sometimes it's easy for these two ideas actually to collide with one another, and it's easy for us to mistake one thing for the other. And I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about, because sometimes they will overlap. So in other words, sometimes what will happen in our life is that we'll come to a place in our life where we realize that we don't know ourselves very well. Has anybody been there sometime in your life, in your past? Maybe you thought you did, but then all of a sudden something changes in your life, a relationship changes. I find this to be many of the cases when people when they lose their spouse, or when they have a change in a relationship, or they lose a friend, or they move to a new location. And that displacement often raises lots of questions, and they say, I don't know if I know who I am anymore, right? And so sometimes we'll spend some time, we'll say, I'm going to focus on myself a little bit, which means that I'm going to try to kind of understand or learn more about who I am, what I'm about, what I think is important. If you've had that experience and you've actually talked about it with others, I would be willing to bet at least a small amount of money that there was probably somebody in your life that might have thought and even said to you, you're acting selfish, right? And I would say, in part, a lot of women have this challenge, right? Because so many times in the course of our history, especially in our American culture, women have been asked and expected to put their own life kind of on hold, or on the side, or on the back burner, or even completely off the agenda so that their male spouse can be the center of attention. That's not the case in every relationship, but it's certainly the case in many. I think of my parents as being a perfect example. They're happy. I'm not saying they aren't happy, but my mother could have done a lot of other things with her life, but she chose to sort of follow my father and what he decided to do. So for her to discover herself and to find out who she is, or to dig deeper into that, would really require a major amount of energy and in some ways some distance from my father's life and experience. Some of you are nodding your head, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Okay? Because that's what happened. This is the problem in Christianity, is that I think as soon as we start talking about self-awareness, we have this tendency to start talking about it as if somehow that's a selfish thing to do. But it really isn't at all. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be moments where we can become selfish. But becoming self-aware is not about being selfish. That is not really what it's about at all. And I would contend that to be self-aware is one of our primary callings as human beings. And certainly one of our callings as Christians. It's quintessential. As a matter of fact, I would be willing to say, without any shadow of a doubt, that self-awareness is the bedrock of Christian spirituality. And many other writers would say that. They might say it in a variety of ways. But they would say, unless you know your identity in God, it's very difficult to develop a Christian spiritual life. Now, it's also the case that self-awareness is not about being, here's another self-word, self-conscious. Right? That's a whole other, this is another term that we sometimes throw around. So when we're talking about self-conscious, it does sound a little bit like self-awareness. But self-conscious actually also includes a sort of unhealthy aspect. In other words, where we're constantly observing ourselves and evaluating everything that we're doing, right? So we want to be self-aware, but we don't want to be a person who's so self-conscious that, we can't go outside because we don't have the right clothes on, or we can't talk to somebody because we're too self-conscious about the way we look, or all the ways in which we can become self-conscious. Self-consciousness actually can move us to being paralyzed.
Well, self-awareness can mean knowing your strengths as well as your weaknesses.
That's right. Certainly.
Everybody thinks of weaknesses. It's knowing your strengths also.
That's right. That's exactly right. And again, I would even contend that below the positives and the negatives, the weaknesses and the strengths, is still this question of identity. That's apart from anything about whether we have strengths or weaknesses. Though that's included, but there's this kind of fundamental place I'm trying to get to that sort of underscores or serves as the foundation for some of this other conversation. So, but you're right, it includes both of those things. I think it's too common for Christians to often think about the false part and not about the good things. It's also the case that self-awareness is not just about what we think, right? Sometimes we think self-awareness is about, I need to know what my mind is about something. And that's true, there is a certain element of that. Self-awareness includes some of that. But again, I would say below that is another question around foundation and identity. One of the things that I think about when I think about self-awareness is that in order to get to this question of identity, there has to be also some sense of appreciation for that you and I, we're different than other things in this world. So, in other words, you and I are not like this table, or like the salt shaker, or the chair, right? You and I are human beings, which means that we have agency. We can make decisions. We can make choices. The table doesn't make the decision to be a table. At least not that I know of so far. Maybe there'll be some sort of scientific movie that will tell us otherwise. But the salt shaker doesn't make a decision to be a salt shaker, or to be there rather than there, right? But you and I, we as human beings, we're different than that. We actually make choices. We have what we would call agency. And this is also one of these other aspects of this sort of identity that we're trying to get at. Because part of the Christian life, part of the Christian spiritual path, is to come to terms with the fact that you and I have choices, and that we make choices. That does perhaps sound maybe a little bit simplistic, maybe to some of you. But if you push on that a little bit and you think about your own life, and again, I don't know anybody personally very well in the room, so I hope I'm not treading on any toes. But in my experience in life, especially as dealing with seminarians, when we go to talk about this, I realize how easy it is for any of us to talk about things that happen to us as if we're passive and that we have not made any choices. That so much of what's happened to us in life is because somebody else has made a decision, and we don't want to come forward and say, actually, I made a choice. Now, I might regret that I made that choice, but I made that choice. So part of the reason I'm here, or this is happening, in part is because I made the choice to be in this relationship, to study this degree, to take this job, to move to this place, to be in a relationship with this person, whatever it is, to join this church, right? And so making that kind of choice makes us very uneasy, I think, as human beings. But it's really foundational, again, to this understanding of our identity. It's got to, this is one of the key components. Does that make sense to you all? Are you following me in this? At least for the most part. I'll say more, hopefully can unpack some of this. Now, what complicates all this? And we clergy, not Father Patrick or Beth, because they're perfect. Mark's not here, so I don't know about him, so we'll just have to see where he falls. But the one place that this all gets complicated is in the language of self-denial. And you hear about it in the Gospels, unless you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Right? And we talk about spiritual denial as being the way, one of the ways in which we follow the spiritual path, and it's a way to become holy. And more than likely, we will hear something like that either on Ash Wednesday or in the Sundays that follow. But in some ways, I think the language of self-denial is a bit of an unfortunate term. It would be nice if we could find some new language for it. Because self-denial is more than about denying oneself. It's much more complex than that. So, if I were to put it in a nutshell, I would say self-denial is less about denying oneself and more about finding out who we really are. Right? So the path from Ash Wednesday to Easter, and on to Pentecost, is ultimately the path about finding out about who we are as human beings. But there's something about the Paschal mystery, the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, that tells us about who we are as human beings. And so the practices that we keep during this period should be things that help us understand more deeply our identity in God. So if we're going to talk about denying ourselves something, which is usually how we talk about this, we should make sure that we are denying ourselves from those things that prevent us from knowing about ourselves. Or, let's put it another way, we deny ourselves those things which are distractions, things that are not ultimately very important. So let me give an example, the most common example. Unpack this a little bit. Let's take fasting and abstinence, which are two big popular things. And I'll say this, although I'm sure you all know this, there is usually some distinction between fasting and abstaining, right? So although they, again, sometimes get kind of brought together or overlap, abstaining normally means withholding or not eating or behaving in a certain way, in a very particular way. So you abstain from a particular item. So I abstain from meat. I abstain from alcohol. I abstain from desserts. So that's very particular. Fasting actually is not eating, and typically not eating for certain kinds of periods. Sometimes it can be not eating in between meals. That's perhaps the most common one. It might involve eating less food when we do eat, but normally it means going for periods without eating at all. And in the Christian tradition, there's a long traditions of periods where we don't eat in between meals, and sometimes where we don't eat for days. Very few people practice this anymore, but some of you may remember the days when you might not eat at all on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. You might fast all the way from Thursday night after the Lord's Supper, and then you wouldn't eat again until Saturday night or Sunday morning during the Easter Triduum. It used to be called the Black Fast, because it really was only water. You're not allowed to eat anything else. I don't find very many people participating in that kind of fasting anymore. But, and I know you all know this, but it's good to say this, is that these kind of fasting, or abstaining, if we're talking about abstaining from meat or sweets, these are not church-sanctioned diets, right? That's not what this is about. You don't fast from desserts during Lent so that you can lose 10 pounds by Easter, right? And then you just have a big peanut butter chocolate egg on Easter morning. That was the way we were taught as kids almost. And my brother would fast, we would, as growing up Catholic, we couldn't eat meat on Fridays. And so at 12:01 on Friday night, he would make these huge Dagwood sandwiches. I don't remember the big Dagwood in the comic strips. And he would make these huge sandwiches and eat them. And I used to think, I don't know what's wrong with this, but I know there's something not right. I couldn't quite figure it out. The older I got, I realized that this is not the point. The point isn't to withhold from something so that you can then gorge on it later. That's not the point. That undermines the whole process. Ultimately, if you're going to talk about fasting from food or abstaining from food, the whole point of the process is to find out how much food we really need to eat in order to live. That's what fasting and abstinence is about. It's about finding out how much do we really need to eat all of that in order to live. Because in the great tradition of Christianity, one of the things that our ancestors would say is fasting isn't fasting unless someone else eats in your place. That's the whole point of fasting. You don't fast and say, save up all the money so that you can have a big steak on Easter morning or Easter afternoon, right? That the money that you would save from eating meat should be given to the poor, for people who can eat. And the idea is that by fasting or abstaining and realizing what you need to eat in order to live a healthy life, that you generate a healthy way of living so that you don't go back to it. In other words, that you don't go back to gorging yourself on whatever it is that you've abstained from. So that after 6 weeks of fasting, you realize, you know what, I don't need to eat all of that food. I can actually eat and live on less. And I can use the excess of that to help others. Because ultimately, at the root of the practice is a kind of challenge, or maybe even an assumption, that you and I, as human beings, really don't know ourselves very well. Do you agree with that? We don't know ourselves very well. We'd like to think that we do. And there's some things that we do know about ourselves. I'm not saying we don't know anything. I'm just saying that we probably don't know ourselves as well as we could. And to be honest, when I think about this, there are moments where I really don't want to know anymore. It's like, I know enough. I really don't tell me anymore. the other thing it does is by looking, one of the great things about fasting, whether it's food or whether it's fasting from other things, I invite our students to do this all the time, every year. They have to pray, fast, and give alms. And they practice this for several weeks. And one of the things that they notice is that they notice the various ways in which, when you start to fast, and I don't care whether it's fasting from saying ill things about other people, or fasting from desserts, you realize how quickly that can get on our nerves, and how quickly that can escalate. We can become moody and cranky, and sometimes we get upset because our cycle is disturbed. We have this ritual of always having, now I'm going to speak a cookie and coffee in the afternoon. And so I'm fasting from sweets, and I can't have one at 4 o'clock. And so, I can handle it a day or two, but after a week goes by, then I start to get cranky. It's like, I want my cookie with my coffee, I want my dessert on whatever it is. Or meat. I realize after going 6 weeks without eating meat, in our household we don't eat meat at all during Lent. In the first few weeks I think, why don't we do this all the time? This is easy, this is great. And then I get into week 5, and then my energy level's low, I'm getting cranky, I'm getting irritable, I'm thinking, why are we doing this? Right? And so one of the things it does is it just reveals kind of like lots of things about myself. It reveals lots of things about ourselves when we do this. And one of the things it does, it also reveals the various ways in which we try to shore up a life. In other words, how we try to make our life make sense, or ways in which we try to make our life have meaning. And it's not that all those things are bad, it's just that ultimately Christianity is asking us to get to that fundamental question about who we are, and we're trying to hold ourselves together by cookies and coffee, in my case, right? Or I'm trying to shore up my life by, let's say, for instance, somebody gives up shopping during Lent. It's become a new thing to fast from shopping because so many people struggle with this, even as an addiction. And they realize that going an entire season without buying any clothes, especially shopping for clothes, they begin to realize how much of their identity is tied up in what they wear. Like, I think I'm not successful, or I think I'm not wealthy, or they're going to think that I'm whatever, right? And so you realize, after fasting for a while, that we've shored up a life based on what clothes we have on our back. And you think, okay, wait a second, something's not quite right here. Again, you might get away with it for a week or two, but you go into weeks 4 and weeks 5, and then you start getting into the real challenge of fasting. And you say, okay, something's going on here. But you see, all of those things I've been talking about, we call that self-denial, but it's not denying the self at all. I mean, it might be in sort of popular language, but we're not denying the self at all. We're actually removing those things that keep us from seeing who we are, things that are exterior to us. Things that we eat, things that we buy. All of those things pass away, we shift to the side, and then we say, okay, well then what's left of me? Then who am I if I can't think about what it is that I'm eating, or what that I'm wearing, or maybe you say I'm not going to go to restaurants for an entire season of Lent. Well, if I can't go out to dinner, who am I? How can I show my status in the world if I can't go out to a restaurant? So we're going to take it this kind of another angle about this question about identity. Let me check in before I do this. Questions, observations, confusions? Is it making sense so far, kind of following? Some yes, some no? Okay, jury's still out. Let's take it from let's talk about for a moment who we are then. What is our identity? I don't know if you've had any chance to look at some of the pictures that are coming back to us from the Hubble telescope. You know, this famous telescope that we have up in the sky they put a number of years ago. They keep refining the telescope every so often, and the pictures that we're getting are incredible. If you get a chance to go onto a computer and you just go onto the internet, onto the computer and type in Hubble telescope and go onto the website and look at some of the pictures, you'll be blown away at what we can actually see now. So let me tell you some of the statistics that they're telling us now, based on what they see from the Hubble telescope. There are actually over 3,000 galaxies that they can count. Over 3,000 galaxies. Can you believe that? We're in one of those galaxies. When I was growing up, that's all you could talk about was I don't even know if there was more than one galaxy when I was growing up. It was the Milky Way, that was it, Now, over 3,000 galaxies. The number of stars, they can't even count the number of stars that there are in the sky. It's become absolutely impossible. And there's certainly no word for the number, like million, trillion. What they say now is that it's somewhere between 10 to the 22nd degree or 10 to the 24th degree. I don't even know how to say that mathematically. I think I said that correctly. That's a lot. That's a lot of stars. So this is a kind of a big, the hugest possible picture of creation that we can imagine at this point. Larger than anybody in our entire human history have ever been able to conceive. Even when Abraham looked up into the sky and God said, look at the stars of the sky, this is what your descendants will be. Even Abraham didn't see that many stars. He saw a lot of them. He saw more than you would see going out here in Columbia. But he didn't see that many stars. Now think about this. So the God who made that is the same God we believe that made us. And two, this God is the God in whom you and I are made in the image of. We are made in the image of a God who created over 3,000 galaxies and so many stars you can't count them. I don't know about you, but that kind of blows my mind. Because when I look at my own little life, I think, okay, there's no way I could possibly have any connection with a God who has that kind of capability. There's nothing in me that has any connection with that. And yet, that's what our faith teaches us. That is what our faith asks us to embrace. That God says to us, I made you in my image. That, my friends, is our identity. Or perhaps to put it in another way, maybe it's a little more palpable, is that our identity is that we are God's beloved. You might say God's beloved children if you want to say that. But we are God's beloved, which is also something that comes to us through scriptures. And it's not just that the Gospels especially tell us that we are made in God's image, but it's also the case that the Gospels in particular also tell us to not pay attention to many of the other distinctions that you and I like to make, right? So the Gospel of Luke is particularly good for this. We just came out of the Gospel of Luke last liturgical season, ending the Christ the King last fall. If you remember back to some of those Gospel passages throughout the Gospel of Luke, one of the things you might remember is that Jesus was constantly, again and again and again, taking up questions of identity. And every time he did, he kept saying in one way or another, this is who you think you are, but you're not. You're using the wrong labels. You divide yourselves up between aliens and legal residents, thank you. You divide yourselves up between mothers and fathers and daughters and sons. You divide yourself up between clean and unclean. Luke just goes on and on and on. You describe yourselves as handicapped and healthy. And Jesus says again and again, don't you get it? All of those distinctions, all of them are meaningless in the eyes of God. That is not your identity in the eyes of God. Now, they may be important to us here on earth, and we may have some traction with them for one reason or another. But ultimately, in the bigger schema, Jesus says, at least in the Gospel of Luke, your identity is beloved children of God. That is your identity. And everything comes from there. Isn't this, I think about this, this is the thing that we try to teach our children when they're very young. One of the ways in which we do that is we sing This Little Light of Mine, right? I remember as a child growing up in the Disciple of Christ Church, in Children's Church, Norma Jean, Mrs. Core would be on the piano, Mrs. Braun would be up in front of the kids leading us, singing This Little Light of Mine as a group. But one of the things they would do is, it wasn't just that we sang it as a group, but Mrs. Braun would say, okay, what about you, Joey? And then Joey would have to sing his verse all by himself. And what about you, Joni? Joni, she'd have to sing the verse by herself. In other words, each of us would have to say, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. In other words, I have to claim my identity as a beloved child of God. Just as kind of a side note, I think this is why it's so important that we get children to church. Whatever way we can. Because if they don't get it in church, I'm not saying that there aren't great things in society, and society is evil, but they need to get it in church. Because you and I know this, those of us who grew up in the church and heard that message as children, we know it doesn't make your life easy, but what it does is that when life comes along and the storms of life come along and all the other things that come along to try to tell you that you're something else, the church hopes that you'll remember that song or something like it. You'll remember that moment in your childhood where the church taught you that your true identity. Your true identity isn't what other people say about you. It isn't the names that they call you. It isn't the labels that they put on you. None of those things are who you are. But unless you've had that fundamental experience of knowing who you are in God, you won't be able to buffet those storms. It's hard enough to buffet them as it is.
I just want to pick up on that and say, it's a lot easier to acknowledge the we in that we are beloved by God, than it is often to realize I.
That's right. Can you say why you think that maybe?
It may come into that, it's easier to recognize our sin. And I think a piece of that too comes from, my son is 8, I told you that. So much of what others do to us is point out. And so we buy into that external stimuli rather than being able to claim. Even if we know internally that I am a child of God, claiming it and owning it is hard, I think, for a lot of us.
I think that's true.
I think part of that is we have been taught so well that pride is a sin. And so for me to claim it personally that I'm a beloved child of God can be, from our training, seen as pride. You know, even our faults, to emphasize, emphasize our blessings and our positives is often, we've been taught from childhood, that's pride. You know, I'm a good speaker, that's pride.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
we constantly kind of check our positive self-awareness against the sin of pride, which leaves us mainly to focus on the negatives. So yeah, corporately it's easy to say, you know, as a preacher, it's easy to say we are the beloved children of God. It's much harder to look in the mirror and say, I'm a beloved child of God. Because then it's like, well, is that my pride? And is it not recognizing all of the things that are faults in me? So I think part of it is that we've been trained not to think positive about ourselves because of the pride, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
Pride was the big one.
That's right, it is. I think it's also conversely the case that when we start talking about sin, the church as a whole has a resistance to talking about it as a group and likes to talk about it as individual, which is also just as problematic, right? Because so much of what you and I count, first of all, much of what you and I count as sin probably doesn't make much difference to God, but that's a whole other conversation. But the things that really probably do matter to God are things that are much larger than any one of us. They really have to do with much larger, what we might call social sins, or things that are nets, mechanisms that really hold all of us bound, and that you have to work tremendously to get out of, to escape. And that you can't really escape by yourself. It's so communal, like it's so ingrained in us. So I think you're right on both of those. It's really, really quite difficult to have that kind of foundation as an individual. The one thing I would say as a kind of, I would say remedy, but a kind of countermeasure, is when we do remind ourselves that we are a beloved child of God, like when we talk to ourselves, and maybe we need to do that, just look in the mirror in the morning when you're brushing your teeth and take a good look and say, I'm a beloved child of God. You might want to remember that God says that to you, right? This is not what you're claiming necessarily just like out of your own thin air. You know? It's like, I'm the king of France. No, that's not. No, God tells me I'm a beloved child of God. That's the testimony. That's the testimony that's been passed on to us. It's not something that we have cooked up. You haven't cooked this up on your own. So when you're tempted to think that this might be pride, remember that it's part of this much larger tradition that we were part of.
Some of these things that you have are gifts that God gave you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not necessarily pride. It's something you're using what God gives you.
That's right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? The ability to speak and things, you know. You got to always remember we're using His gifts.
So one of the things that I think happens is, and I'm going to talk for a moment about the people who were raised in the church. We can talk about the people who haven't been raised in the church. That's a kind of another conversation too. But for people who've been raised in the church, I think what happens is that they hopefully have gotten that message. Maybe they got it in a generic sense, that we are all beloved children of God. Maybe they didn't get the individual sense of that. But often what happens is, even if they got the individual sense of it, is that they become amnesic. That is, they forget who they are. Despite what everybody tells them, right? Sometimes, and isn't that what again, when we have children who are growing up and they go out for the first time and the big speech is, remember who you are, you know? In other words, remember how I raised you to be, et cetera, et cetera. Then in the same way, the church should be telling this to us. And then when we're going down into the Word, remember who you are. Remember that you are a child of God. Remember that you specifically, not as a group, but you specifically are a child of God. But in so many cases, all of us are vulnerable and we forget. And the problem is that what happens when we forget is that we look for other ways to justify our existence. So, like, if you use as your defense that I am a beloved child of God because God says so, you can navigate the world, but if you lose that sense, then oftentimes you have to find something else to justify your existence. Why am I here? Why am I important? Why do I matter to the world? Why should I matter? Well, I matter because I've got this gift, or I can say these things, or I matter because I have money, or I matter because I live in this zip code, or I matter because I'm American. That's right.
I'm a mother.
I'm a mother.
Wife.
That's right. Mother, wife, father. I'm the son of, I'm the daughter of so-and-so. So you see how what happens is that in the forgetting of our identity, when that happens, then all of the shoring up starts. All of the might call it justification starts. So when we're talking about self-denial, what we're really talking about is not denying who we really are. We're denying the things that we think tell us who we are. So that our real identity in God can emerge. That we can let go of all those things that we hold on to as attachments that we think tell us who we are, but really don't. One of the things I think this was really important about this is that for so many people, especially those people who have not been allowed to have a self, they need to hear this message. I think particularly, I think of women in particular, because so many women in our culture haven't been told that they've been able to have a self. But I think this is the case for a lot of different kinds of groups of people in our world. Many underprivileged or underserved populations have been told they're not allowed to have a self. They're not allowed to have a choice. They're not allowed to have agency. And that as soon as they try to have a self or to talk about it, then they're automatically talked about as being selfish or prideful. And when that happens, I think we've engaged in the wrong conversation. And I know those of you who have had this experience know what I'm talking about. So let me ask you this question 1. So the first question on the back of their sheet says, and I want you to think for a moment, if you haven't had a chance, what are the ways in which you have established an identity or a self? When you look back over your life, what are the things that you think of when you would describe yourself as part of your identity?
Job.
Your job. Can you say a little more? Just
Well, you can elaborate on what it means to you, or it brings you to relate to people, what your job, what part of you is.
Right. So the work that we do, the job that we do often is, for many of us, a very strong part of our identity.
Right.
What else?
Your marital status.
Marital status. It's a big...
I'm a daughter, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a pastor, I'm a teacher.
You got lots of them.
We all do.
Me too. Other ones you've noticed?
Where you live.
Where you live? Can you say a little more, like a little more specifically what?
Some people feel they need to live in a certain community to feel more important.
Like if you live in Columbia.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm white, I'm middle class. I mean, there's, spit it out,
That's
there's
right.
probably dozens of them if you really.
Some of our identities we don't even talk about. Some of them are so embedded that we don't even, like the ones about being white or middle class, we might not even talk about. We just assume that. I'm not from here, so but I do hear this, what community you're from.
Right.
So sometimes what micro neighborhood you're, like what street. I live in Lancaster City, which that in itself is, depending on who you're talking to, good or bad. But what street you live on in Lancaster City is a big deal, and what block sometimes of what street. If you live on the 500 block of North Mary and you live on the 100 block of North Mary, and you know anything about Lancaster City, you'll know it's a very different thing, right? So yeah, you can take a lot from that. I think also being heterosexual would also be one of those, along with being white and middle class, that are untalked about. It's just assumed. So in other words, if you're not that, then you have to sort of opt to identify yourself as not being that. The assumption is we start with that. You're white, you're middle class, and you're heterosexual. If you're not that, then you have to tell us.
David, I think one that gets talked about in the absence is I'm a citizen.
Yes.
It's talked about in the opposite.
Say a little more.
Well, I mean, it's, illegal immigrants, immigration reform, all of those things, they get talked about as those items versus the fact that my identity, that I am a citizen.
Oh yes, that's right. That's right.
But it never really comes out in conversation except in the opposite. I'm not like them.
That's right.
Who are an illegal or an immigrant.
That's right.
Or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Sometimes the identity is a negative one. So you have the identity as being an alien. I don't have any, there's no identity for me because I'm normal, so to speak. Yeah, that's true. That's exactly what that means. And it's amazing to think about some of these ones that we go unnamed, in some ways are the most powerful ones, and the ones in which we have the most discord over in our life together, both as individuals, as a nation, and as a country. These are some of the most conflictual elements.
Just the statement, I'm an American,
Mm-hmm.
has an identity to it, but it has lots of other issues that all get tied into that. When someone says, I'm an American, it's usually when you're talking to somebody who's not.
Yes.
And the power, prestige, favored nation status, exceptionalism, all of those things come into play
Right.
with just that identity.
We had a group of students who just came back from Israel, Palestine, and they were at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And there was some difficulties getting into the church because of some racial profiling. They weren't going to let certain people in our group. I wasn't there, but our students were there. Once they told the guards that they were American, then they were willing to overlook the color of their skin. It was all about being American. If they thought the person was from another country that they were targeting, they weren't going to let her in. So, very powerful. That identity is a really extraordinarily powerful component of our life together. You see why the gospel, go ahead.
We fail to forget we're all children of
That's right.
You didn't hear that.
We all fail to forget, we all fail to remember that we are children of God. See, this is the problem, right? So we forget our true identity, so we have to create an alternative one. And the odd thing is that we keep fighting over these alternative ones, right? Rather than embracing the one that we all have.
God. Well, it really cares.
The one that really counts, ultimately. Exactly. The one that we share in common, right?
Even
This is
worse, even worse, we fight over who really counts as children of God.
Well, there's that. Yes. That's true. Some of the ways we've done that historically, sometimes we'll, depending on your denominational affiliation, I grew up Roman Catholic, besides disciple of Christ, so I have a long history in this. I know what this is like. Can easily divide people up into different groups. It's also the case that as a body, as Christians, instead of talking about whether somebody's a child of God, sometimes what we'll do is, because that sounds a little too harsh, what we'll do is we'll debate whether they have a soul or not. Right? So if you don't know this, this is part of our American heritage, right? So there was a debate in this country whether Native Americans had souls. This was a conversation that also happened in Mexico when the Spanish came to what's present-day southwest U.S., United States, and Mexico. Because if they could determine that this population didn't have a soul, then they weren't human. Then they could be treated like a table, right? We did the same thing with African Americans in this country, and the same debate went on about whether African American people, the slaves that were brought over, had souls. That was a much more acceptable philosophical kind of conversation rather than talking about whether they were children of God. But that's what we were talking about. So this is serious stuff. The amnesia is serious because the ramifications are significant. Once we forget about who we are, then we're certainly not going to remember who you are, right? If I can't remember that I'm a child of God and what that means and how I've come by that, and by come by that means by no choice or power of my own, then how am I possibly going to acknowledge you as a child of God and the gift that you are? It's almost impossible to do. So So let's go to question 3, the positive part of this. I'm going to re-ask the question because I don't like my question. So that's an academic question. So think about this. Think in your past at a moment when you were able at least to embrace on some level, maybe it's even just remotely or weakly, maybe it's strongly, but you were able to embrace that you are a child of God. Think of a moment in your past.
How can you think of a moment when you've thought it all your life? How can you think of one moment when you thought you were a child of God?
I'm thinking of a moment where you kind of really realized it. Like it moved from your head down into your heart. Like you really sensed, oh, okay, I guess I really am a child of God. Does that help?
I guess, but I still can't. I mean, I have felt that God loved me ever since I was a wee little kid, and I can't recall exactly when I felt any different. I always thought God loved me and that I was a child. So maybe I'm looking at it wrong.
No, I don't think so. Maybe
It's not like these born-again Christians that say they had this specific time when I've never had that in my life, but I've always felt that I was a saved Christian and a child of God.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I'm not talking about a salvation moment. I really am talking about a moment where you had kind of a deeper connection with this notion that you're a child of God. And it could happen in a variety of ways. I mean, it could happen in a moment where you taking communion, or it could happen at a particular moment where you witnessed something, or it could be, I mean, there's a lot of, or the love of another person was so powerful and palpable that it helped you understand, okay, I really am loved.
Well, in that case, I can. I just, actually 10 months ago, I lost my husband very suddenly. And if it wouldn't have been that I knew how much God loved me, I would have never been able to get through that without his love and the grace that he's always shown to me. So in that case, I did feel that. But I felt things other times too.
Yeah.
That was a very, I don't even know how to describe it. But just if I wouldn't have had God, I don't know how I would have gotten through it.
I believe you. No. Thank you. Other examples you're comfortable sharing? There may be some you may not be, but
On a dark night when I'm outside and I look up at the stars and see how infinite I am, I know I'm a child of God. There's no other answer. When you look through that Hubble telescope and see how we are human beings and how he put us here, that's the answer.
yeah. Well, nothing short of miraculous.
Each moment at communion, whether I'm celebrating or part of the congregation, that moment of communion is, it's palpable. It's a visible reality that I'm a child of God. That's when it hits home.
I don't know whether I'm on the right track for what you're thinking of, but I became involved in teaching ladies who were in my secular church, who were about 30 years older probably than I was. And the way that I realized by what they said that I was touching their lives, I knew it was somebody other than me. Maybe I'm off the track of what you're trying here, but that has meant so much to me. That was one of the things.
I think that's, it's not off the track, but it's pointing to what I'm pointing to, but there's probably something even below that or deeper than that in that experience. I mean, what I'm hearing is that you had this experience in which God was able to touch people through you.
Yes.
Yeah. Which means to some extent that you must be not just important, but that you have a relationship with God that could happen. Is it?
It made me effective enough to
Yes.
do this.
No, no. Thank you.
For me, it's the Holy Week services.
Mm. Mm.
10 years in ministry, and I can't get through Maundy Thursday and Good Friday without sobbing through the end of the services.
Mm.
And it just hits me anew every year that Jesus, that God did that for me. I stand up there and proclaim it as an us, but as I'm stripping the altar, it just, and as the cross comes in on Good Friday, it's there every year, every year. Keep hoping this will be the year it doesn't. Hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hang on.
That's right. It may not. That's right. I invite you in the weeks to come to think about that a little bit. It may not be something that will, again, you might not be looking for a big flash. It's not like, this moment where, lightning has struck you. But I would be willing to bet that most of you have had this, if not all of you have had this experience. There's been a moment where you've had this strong, powerful sense that you are beloved by God. Some of us have had this experience and maybe have had it a long time ago. If you read the biography of Mother Teresa, it'd be a good example of somebody who had it very early on in her life and then never had it later. So sometimes what's a little bit challenging by this is that it may not have, for some of us, it may have been a long time ago and we would like to feel that again. Feel it, not just know it, like in our heads. I mean, I hope that we all know it in our heads, but to actually feel it. Sometimes we can go a long time without having that feeling, and that's okay. That's not because we're bad. I think it's just part of the human existence. But the key here is to remember when we did have it and not forget it. And to do what we can to remind ourselves of that. And to remind others of that. The other question I'm going to ask you to think about a little bit is question 5. We go to 8:15, right? Is that right? So, I've been asking this question to people for a while now. And I've been confirmed by how challenging this question can be sometimes. So do you think that God trusts you? Some people have asked me, I don't know what you mean when you say that. I'm not sure I can explain it completely, because it's one of those things that is a little hard to explain. So you know what trust is amongst human beings, right? At least most of us do. We certainly know what trust is like when trust is broken. We often talk about trust or as like, I trust you to do your best job, or I trust you to do the right thing. You hear some people say that. It's usually code language. When I say, I trust you to do the right thing, it normally means I trust you to do what I think you should do. Yes, Mom, I will do what you think. But this is not what I mean by this. I don't mean that God trusts us to do the right thing. I mean that God trusts us, period. So that God trusts us even if we don't do the right thing. God still trusts us. I think one of the ways in which you might be able to read the biblical narrative is a kind of one ongoing saga after another of God trusting humanity. From the very beginning, trusting all of creation to us. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. And somehow God keeps coming back and trusting us. Jesus entrusts the gospel to us, entrusts this powerful message that we are called to live out and proclaim, even if we do it poorly, even if we do it with one hand tied behind our back sometimes. The reason I think this question is so important is because it gets to this place of, ultimately, when we talk about being beloved children of God, I think sometimes we think about it as being a static thing, right? And this is why I think it's kind of a heady thing. That sometimes when we think about, okay, I'm a beloved child of God, it's kind of like I'm like this pepper shaker, and I can sit it on a shelf, right? I'm a beloved child of God, static, there, nice to look at, right? Not something that's active and vibrant and living and engaging and making choices and being in relationship, as well as loving and losing and mourning and grieving, all of those things. So that to talk about God trusting us, it's about inviting us out of that kind of static notion of being a child of God into being a living reality. So, I'm going to ask you to spend some time thinking about that. Take these sheets with you. And do we have a couple minutes, or should we need to stop probably? 2 minutes. Okay. Does anybody have an immediate response to this question or a question about it?
I would say God knows me more than I know you.
You can count on that.
So, I guess he does trust me because he knows me more than I do.
Have you had a sense of that experience? Like, have you ever experienced that? Like, had a particular moment where you said, oh,
I always feel I'm a child of God, you know, and I just look forward to it.
okay.
You know. My thing is, I'm just passing through here,
Mhm.
you know. The key focus is what's ahead.
No. Okay.
You know, I think that's how we gotta look at things.
Okay.
I don't know that God thinks about trusting me. He just knows.
Mm.
I cannot think, in using the word trust, I may not be understanding the question or the thoughts behind it, but why would he trust me? He created human beings with all our faults and good points. Flows through the seasons, he comes back, he comes back to us, the people. I just cannot picture God saying, I trust Martina,
Mm.
or whatever way.
Mhm. Okay.
I think he trusts us because he loves us.
Mm.
And I think with the love comes the trust.
Mhm.
I think it does with just me and somebody else.
Mhm.
I think if I love someone, I will trust them a lot quicker than a complete stranger that I don't even know.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think since he knows me, he would trust me because he knows I love him and he loves me.
Mhm.
I don't know how to explain it any other way.
No, you did just quite fine. You're all doing great. So,
I think from the beginning, God gave us a free will. So I think in that, he trusts us in that sense. And I thought maybe you should have picked up the salt shaker, that we're the salt of the earth.
that's right. After the last gospel.
We flavor what's around us.
That's right. Good point. It's worth spending a little bit of time on, just pondering this a little bit for yourself. So I'm going to ask you about it as your homework. So when I come back on the 24th, I'll ask you, I won't make you speak, but I'll ask anyway. So I want to close with a quote from Henry Nouwen from his book it's a compilation of things about his teachings on spiritual direction that I find quite helpful in thinking about these questions. For most of my life, I have struggled to find God, to know God, to love God. I have tried hard to follow the guidelines of the spiritual life, pray always, work for others, read the scriptures, and to avoid the many temptations to dissipate myself. I have failed many times, but always tried again, even when I was close to despair. Now I wonder whether I have sufficiently realized that during all this time, God has been trying to find me, to know me, and to love me. The question is not how am I to find God, but how am I to let myself be found by God? The question is not how am I to know God, but how am I to let myself be known by God? The question is not how am I to love God, but how am I to let myself be loved by God? And finally, the question is not who is God for me, but who am I to God? The good news is that God is scanning the horizon for me, trying to find me and longing to bring me home. In the same way, God is looking for you. Amen. Thank you. Have a good evening.
We want to thank Dr. Mellott for coming this evening and giving us some insights into who we are. I must say that I have just decided to scrap my Ash Wednesday sermon and start over again.
You got it done already?
Oh, yeah. Not now. Not now. I write my sermons while commuting. So, but we will take all the cookies home, because if not, I'm going to take them home.